Eliza Crowell stood in her father's study, her hands trembling as she stared at the marriage contract bearing another man's name. Outside, the Colorado drought had turned their ranch into a graveyard of dust and dying cattle. Inside, her father's shame hung thick as smoke. "Caleb Hawthorne has agreed to settle our debts," her father said, unable to meet her eyes. "In exchange for your hand." The name alone made her blood run cold. Hawthorne, the cattle baron whose reputation was built on fear, whose silences were more terrifying than any threat, whose past was whispered about in warnings rather than words. If you're drawn to stories of courage, rising from impossible choices, stay with us until the end. Like this video and comment what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the Crowell Ranch, turning the parched earth into something that cracked and bled dust with every step. Eliza stood at the window of the main house, watching her father cross the yard with the gait of a man carrying the weight of his own failure. At 23, she had learned to read the language of her father's shoulders, the slope of defeat, the rigid line of stubborn pride, the tremor of desperation. Today, those shoulders carried all three. She had known this moment was coming. The drought had stretched into its third year, transforming the once lush valley into a monument to suffering. Their cattle had dwindled from 300 head to barely 80, each one a walking skeleton that represented not just lost income, but lost hope. The creek that had run clear and cold for as long as anyone could remember now existed as nothing more than a memory traced in cracked mud and scattered stones. "Eliza!" Her father's voice came from the doorway, rough as wind-scraped stone. "We need to talk." She turned from the window, her hands instinctively smoothing the worn fabric of her work dress. Thomas Crowell had aged a decade in the past 3 years. The man who had once thrown her squealing into the air as a child, who had taught her to ride and rope and read the weather in the mountains, now looked hollowed out, carved empty by circumstances he couldn't control and debts he couldn't pay. "It's about the Anderson note," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. The debt to their neighbor had been the sword hanging over their heads for months now, growing sharper with each passing week. Among others. Her father moved to his desk, his movements careful, as if he feared the wrong gesture might shatter what remained of his dignity. "Anderson's called it due. The bank in Denver is making noises about the mortgage, and the suppliers in town won't extend any more credit for feed." Eliza felt her throat tighten. She had been managing the household account since her mother's death 5 years ago. She knew exactly how dire their situation had become, had watched the numbers spiral beyond recovery despite every economy she could implement. "How much time do we have?" 6 weeks. Maybe 8 if Anderson's feeling generous, which he ain't. Thomas pulled a folded document from his desk drawer, his hands shaking slightly as he smoothed it flat. "But there's a way out. A way to save the ranch, keep the land in the family." Something in his tone made her skin prickle with warning. "What way?" Her father couldn't meet her eyes. "Caleb Hawthorne has made an offer." The name hit her like a physical blow. Every person in the Colorado Territory knew that name, spoke it with a mixture of fear and reluctant respect. Caleb Hawthorne had arrived in the valley 7 years ago with nothing but a string of horses and a reputation that preceded him like a storm front. Within 2 years, he had built the largest ranch operation within 100 miles. Within 5, he'd become the man other men crossed the street to avoid. The stories about him were legion. He'd killed a man in Wyoming, or was it 3 men in Montana? He'd run claim jumpers off his land with nothing but a rifle and a stone-cold stare. He'd broken a horse trader's arm over a dispute about a mare, then bought the man's entire string at half price the next day. He employed 20 hands, paid them well, and ruled them with an iron discipline that brooked no dissent. And he'd never married, never courted, never shown interest in any of the women who'd tried to catch his eye. Until now, apparently. "What kind of offer?" Eliza's voice came out steadier than she felt. "He'll settle all our debts, pay off Anderson, clear the banknote, extend credit with the suppliers. In exchange—" Thomas finally looked up, and the shame in his eyes told her everything before he spoke the words. "In exchange for your hand in marriage." The room seemed to tilt slightly. Eliza gripped the back of a chair, her knuckles going white. can't be serious." "I wouldn't ask if there was any other way." Her father's voice cracked. "Eliza, we're losing everything. Your grandfather built this ranch from nothing. Your mother loved this land. If we lose it to the bank, to creditors." "So you'd sell me instead?" The words came out sharp, edged with a betrayal so deep it made her chest ache. "It's not like that." But his tone said it was exactly like that. "Hawthorne's a wealthy man. You'd want for nothing. And the marriage contract includes provisions. The ranch stays in our family name. You inherit it outright when I pass. Your children would have a legacy." "My children." Eliza heard herself laugh, a bitter sound that had no humor in it. "With Caleb Hawthorne, the man people cross themselves against, the man they say has ice in his veins and no soul behind his eyes." Those are just stories. But her father's defense lacked conviction. "Are they?" Eliza moved to the desk, staring down at the contract that would bind her fate to a stranger's. "Tell me true, Father. Have you ever seen Caleb Hawthorne smile? Have you ever heard him laugh? Do you know anything about him beyond his reputation for being harder than the rocks his cattle graze on?" Thomas Crowell had no answer. Eliza picked up the contract, her hand steady now with a strange, detached calm. The terms were laid out in precise legal language: marriage within the month, immediate settlement of all outstanding debts, transfer of operational control of the Crowell Ranch to Hawthorne management while maintaining family ownership. It was all very neat, very tidy, everything except the human cost. "When did he make this offer?" she asked. 3 days ago. He came here personally, laid it out plain and simple. Said he'd been watching our situation, knew we were in trouble, said he was ready to settle down, wanted a wife who understood ranch life, and figured this was a bargain that would benefit both parties. How generous of him. Eliza set the contract down carefully. "Did he mention anything about what I might want? About whether I have any say in this bargain?" Her father's silence was answer enough. Outside, the wind kicked up, sending dust devils spinning across the empty paddocks. Eliza watched them dance and die, watched them tear apart and reform, watched them disappear into nothing. That's what her life would become, she thought. A temporary thing at the mercy of forces she couldn't control, spinning until she fell apart or disappeared. "I need time to think," she said finally. "We don't have much time." Her father stood, and for a moment he looked like he might reach for her, might offer some comfort or apology. But the space between them had grown too wide, filled with too many unspoken accusations. Hawthorne wants an answer by week's end. Then he'll have one. Eliza left the study and walked through the house that had been her entire world, the kitchen where her mother had taught her to bake bread and preserve fruit, the sitting room where she'd learned to sew and read by lamplight, the bedroom where she dreamed of a future that looked nothing like the one now being offered to her. She ended up in the barn, the one place that still felt honest. Their remaining horses nickered softly at her approach, and she moved to her mare's stall, pressing her forehead against the animal's warm neck. The mare huffed softly, patient and understanding in the way only horses could be. "What would Mama say?" Eliza whispered into the dusty air. "What would she tell me to do?" But her mother had died believing the ranch would survive, that her husband would find a way through the drought, that her daughter would marry for love rather than necessity. She died with illusions intact, and Eliza envied her that mercy. The next 3 days passed in a blur of mechanical routine. Eliza worked alongside their 2 remaining ranch hands, tending cattle that barely had grass to graze, hauling water from the creek bed's deepest pools, mending fence that hardly mattered anymore when there was so little left to contain. She avoided her father, ate her meals in silence, and lay awake each night staring at the ceiling while her mind spun through scenarios that all ended the same way. She could refuse. Watch her father lose everything, watch the land go to strangers, watch the ranch her grandfather had carved from wilderness disappear into creditors' hands. She could run, take her horse and head to Denver or beyond, find work as a seamstress or shop girl or cook. She could accept, trade her freedom for her family's legacy, marry a man she feared, and hope that stories were just stories after all. None of the choices felt like choices. They all felt like different versions of surrender. On the 4th day, she saddled her mare and rode out before dawn, following the fence line toward the high pastures. The morning air was cool, but carried the promise of another scorching day. She rode until she reached the ridge that overlooked both the Crowell Ranch and, in the distance, the sprawling expanse of Hawthorne land. From this vantage point, the contrast was striking. The Crowell Ranch looked tired, depleted, its buildings weathered and its fields brown. But Hawthorne's operation stretched across the valley like a well-oiled machine. Neat fences, sturdy buildings, cattle that actually had flesh on their bones. Windmills turned in the morning breeze, pumping water from deep wells that the drought hadn't reached. Whoever Caleb Hawthorne was, whatever dark stories surrounded him, he clearly knew how to survive. Eliza sat her horse and watched smoke rise from the cookhouse chimney, watched tiny figures moving with purpose between buildings, watched the morning sun turn the distant mountains pink and gold. Somewhere down there, Caleb Hawthorne was beginning his day, probably not giving her a second thought while she tore herself apart over a decision that was already made. Because that was the terrible truth she'd been avoiding for 3 days. There was no real choice. She couldn't watch her father lose everything, couldn't let her family's legacy disappear, couldn't condemn herself to a marginal existence in some distant city when she belonged to this land as much as it belonged to her. The only question was whether she would walk into this marriage as a victim or make it something else through sheer force of will. She turned her mare toward home, her jaw set with a determination that felt like armor. If Caleb Hawthorne wanted a wife who understood ranch life, he would get one. If he wanted a bargain, she would make sure it cut both ways. And if he thought he was purchasing a docile, grateful bride, he was about to learn otherwise. Her father was waiting on the porch when she returned, his face gray with worry and sleeplessness. Eliza dismounted, handed her reins to one of the hands, and climbed the steps with her head high. "I'll do it," she said, her voice carrying no doubt. "Tell Mr. Hawthorne I accept his offer, but I have conditions of my own." Hope and relief flooded her father's expression. "Eliza, thank you. You don't know what this—" "My conditions," she interrupted, her tone brooking no argument. "I want them in writing, added to the contract. First, this ranch remains Crowell property, with me as the named heir regardless of any children I may have. Second, I retain the right to manage the Crowell operation as I see fit, with input but not interference. Third, any children born to this marriage will bear both Hawthorne and Crowell names equally." Her father blinked. "I'm not sure Hawthorne will agree to—" "Then there's no deal." Eliza held his gaze until he looked away. "I'm giving up my freedom, Father. I'm marrying a stranger to save your legacy. The least you can do is make sure I have some ground to stand on when I do. I'll present your terms to him." "Good." Eliza moved toward the door, then paused. "And Father, when you see Mr. Hawthorne, you can tell him something else. Tell him I'm not afraid of him. Tell him I'm not some fragile flower who'll wilt under hard stares and harsh words. If he wants a partnership, he'll get one. But if he wants a slave, he's bought himself a lifetime of disappointment." She didn't wait for his response, just walked into the house and closed the door firmly behind her. 2 days later, a rider came from Hawthorne Ranch with the revised contract. Eliza's conditions had been accepted without amendment or negotiation, the additions penned in the same bold, angular handwriting that had signed the original document. There was also a brief note, folded separately. "Miss Crowell, your terms are acceptable and have been incorporated as requested. The wedding will take place at the ranch on Saturday, the 15th, at noon. A wagon will be sent for you and your belongings on Friday afternoon. I appreciate your direct approach to this arrangement. Honesty serves both parties better than false sentiment. C. Hawthorne." No flowery language, no pretense at courtship or romance, just the facts, plain and simple. Eliza didn't know whether to be insulted or relieved. She settled for neither, instead focusing on the monumental task of preparing to leave the only home she'd ever known. She had 6 days. The women from neighboring ranches came to help, though their assistance was mixed with barely concealed pity and morbid curiosity. They brought fabrics for a wedding dress, simple cream wool, practical for ranch life, and stayed to sew while peppering Eliza with questions that ranged from tactless to cruel. "Is it true he once shot a man for trespassing? I heard he doesn't allow women at his ranch. How will you manage? My cousin saw him in town once, said his eyes were cold as a snake's." Eliza endured it all with tight-lipped grace, focusing on the rhythm of her needle-pulling thread, creating something new from pieces that had been separate. It felt like a metaphor she wasn't ready to examine too closely. Her father tried, in his awkward way, to offer comfort. Hawthorne's a hard man, but he's fair. Treats his workers well, pays his debts, keeps his word. Those are fine qualities in a business partner, Eliza replied, not looking up from the dress she was hemming. I'm not sure how they translate to marriage. He'll provide for you, protect you. I don't need protection, Father. I needed a choice. There's a difference. The conversation ended there, as most of their conversations ended these days, an uncomfortable silence that spoke louder than words. Friday arrived with brutal speed. The wagon from Hawthorne Ranch appeared precisely at 2 o'clock, driven by a weather-beaten man who introduced himself as Samuel, the ranch foreman. He was polite but distant, treating Eliza with the careful respect one might show fragile cargo. Loading her belongings took less time than she'd expected. Her whole life fit into 3 trunks and a carpet bag. Her mother's wedding ring, worn on a chain around her neck, her grandmother's quilt, books, clothes, a few photographs. The physical evidence of 23 years could be stacked and tied down in less than an hour. Her father helped her into the wagon, his hands shaking slightly as he gripped her arm. Eliza, Save it, she said, not unkindly but firmly. We've said everything there is to say. She didn't look back as the wagon pulled away. She kept her eyes forward, watching Hawthorne Land grow closer while Crowell Land receded behind her. The sun was beginning its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, beautiful and indifferent, like everything else in this vast territory. The Hawthorne Ranch revealed itself gradually. First the outlying buildings, bunkhouse, barn, stables, each one built solid and maintained with obvious care. Then the main house, a sprawling structure of timber and stone that looked like it had grown out of the land itself rather than been imposed upon it. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys. Flower boxes hung beneath windows, unexpected touches of color that seemed at odds with everything she'd heard about the man who lived here. Samuel guided the wagon to the main house, where a woman waited on the porch. She was perhaps 50, with iron gray hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that missed nothing. She descended the steps as the wagon stopped, her expression neither welcoming nor hostile. Miss Crowell, I'm Ruth Hanson. I manage the household. Her voice was crisp, efficient. Mr. Hawthorne is delayed with a situation in the north pasture, but sent word that you should be made comfortable. I'll show you to your room. Your room, singular. Eliza caught the implication and felt a small knot of tension ease in her chest. Whatever else this marriage would be, it apparently wouldn't include immediate intimacy. She followed Ruth into the house, her first impressions coming in rapid succession. Clean, orderly, surprisingly refined. The furniture was heavy and practical, but well made. Books lined shelves in the main room. The floors were polished wood, not dirt. Windows let in the dying light, and lamps already glowed against the coming darkness. Ruth led her upstairs to a corner room with windows facing both east and south. The bed was large and neatly made with a quilt that looked handmade. A wardrobe stood against one wall, a washstand with pitcher and basin against another. A small desk sat beneath one window, complete with paper and ink. Your trunks will be brought up shortly, Ruth said. Supper's at 6. Mr. Hawthorne usually takes his meals in the dining room, but tonight he's arranged for a tray to be sent to your room, given the circumstances. The wedding is at noon tomorrow, as you know. Reverend Morrison will be coming from town. Eliza turned from her inspection of the room. And Mr. Hawthorne? What about him? Will I see him before the wedding? Ruth's expression softened slightly. That's his decision, Miss Crowell. But if I were to guess, I'd say he's giving you tonight to settle in without additional complications. After Ruth left, Eliza stood at the window watching the ranch settle into evening routines. Men moved between buildings with purpose. Horses were being fed and bedded down. Lights appeared in the bunkhouse windows. Everything ran like clockwork, organized and efficient. Somewhere out there was the man she would marry tomorrow. The man whose reputation had preceded him like a dark legend. The man who had purchased her hand with a contract instead of courting her with words and flowers. She pressed her palm against the cool glass and wondered if he was watching his future wife the same way she was wondering about her future husband, with more questions than answers, more apprehension than hope. Tomorrow she would find out. Tomorrow she would stand beside Caleb Hawthorne and speak vows that would bind them for life. Tomorrow she would stop being Eliza Crowell and become Eliza Hawthorne, wife to a stranger, mistress of a house that wasn't home. But tonight, she was still herself, still free in the small, sacred space between the life she'd known and the life that awaited. She intended to hold on to that space for as long as she could. The sun finally dropped below the mountains, and darkness settled over the valley like a curtain falling. Eliza lit the lamp on her desk, its warm glow pushing back the shadows. She pulled out paper and pen, thinking she might write. To whom? She wasn't sure. A letter to her former self, perhaps. A prayer to her mother. A declaration of intent to the woman she hoped to become. But when pen touched paper, no words came. The future was too uncertain, the present too strange. She set the pen down and simply sat in the lamplight, listening to the sounds of an unfamiliar house settling around her, preparing for a tomorrow that would change everything. In the distance, a coyote called. Another answered. The sound was lonely and wild and perfectly suited to how she felt, caught between territories, neither here nor there, calling out to something that might or might not call back. Eliza woke to unfamiliar sounds. The creak of floorboards overhead, voices drifting from somewhere below, the rhythmic clang of a triangle announcing breakfast for the ranch hands. For one disoriented moment, she thought she was still at home, that the previous day had been nothing but a vivid nightmare. Then she opened her eyes to the corner room with its south-facing windows and east-facing light, and reality settled over her like a weight. Today she would marry Caleb Hawthorne. She rose and dressed carefully in one of her simpler dresses, leaving the cream wool wedding dress hanging where Ruth had placed it the night before. The face that looked back at her from the small mirror above the washstand seemed older than it had yesterday, marked by a night of restless sleep and circular thoughts that had led nowhere productive. A soft knock came at the door. Ruth entered carrying a breakfast tray, her expression revealing nothing of what she might think about the day's coming events. "Morning, Miss Crowell. Thought you might prefer to eat up here before the preparations begin." She set the tray on the desk, eggs, bacon, biscuits with honey, strong coffee that smelled like salvation. The ceremony's at noon in the main room downstairs. Reverend Morrison arrived an hour ago. Some of the neighboring ranch families are coming as witnesses, though Mr. Hawthorne kept the guest list small. Eliza poured coffee, grateful for something to do with her hands. Is Mr. Hawthorne in the house? Been up since 4 as usual. Right now he's meeting with the foreman about moving cattle to the upper pasture. Ruth moved to the wardrobe, beginning to lay out Eliza's things with practiced efficiency. He asked me to tell you that if you need anything at all, you should send word. He wants you to be comfortable. Comfortable? Eliza tested the word, found it wanting. That's an interesting choice, given the circumstances. Ruth paused in her work, turning to face Eliza directly. May I speak plain, Miss Crowell? I wish you would. I've worked for Mr. Hawthorne for 5 years. In that time, I've seen him face down claim jumpers, survive a winter that killed half the valley's cattle, and build this ranch from almost nothing into what you see today. I've also seen him sit up 3 nights straight nursing a colicky foal because he'd given his word to the mare's previous owner that he'd care for her. I've seen him forgive debts for workers with sick children and personally ride 20 miles in a blizzard to fetch the doctor for a ranch hand's wife in difficult labor. She crossed her arms, her gaze steady and unflinching. I'm not saying he's an easy man. He's hard, and he expects people to pull their own weight, and he doesn't suffer fools or laziness. But he's fair, and his word is absolute, and if you're looking for a tyrant or a monster, you won't find one here. Eliza absorbed this, turning her coffee cup in slow circles. The stories about him, some are true, most are exaggerated, a few are complete fabrication. Ruth moved back to her organizing. But here's what I know for certain. When Mr. Hawthorne says he'll do something, he does it. When he makes a promise, he keeps it. And when he brought your contract to me to review, yes, he asked my opinion. He specifically asked what provisions I thought should be included to protect your interests. This brought Eliza's head up sharply. He asked you. Who better to know what a woman might need than another woman? Ruth's expression softened slightly. I suggested the separate room, the allowance for personal expenses, and the clause ensuring you'd have say in household management. He added them without hesitation. Eliza felt something shift in her chest, a small easing of the tight knot that had lived there since her father first spoke Hawthorne's name. It didn't erase her fear or her anger at being traded like livestock, but it suggested that perhaps the man she was marrying had more dimensions than the legend allowed. "Thank you for telling me," she said quietly. "You'll form your own opinions soon enough." Ruth headed for the door, then paused. "One more thing. Mr. Hawthorne asked me to give you this." She produced a small wooden box from her apron pocket, setting it on the desk beside Eliza's untouched breakfast. He said it belonged to his mother. After Ruth left, Eliza stared at the box for a long moment before opening it. Inside, nestled on faded velvet, lay a wedding ring, simple gold, worn smooth with age, engraved with tiny flowers along its band. A note accompanied it, written in that same bold, angular hand. "This ring has no monetary value, but it was precious to the woman who wore it. If you prefer something newer, I can arrange it. If not, I would be honored to see it worn again. The choice is yours. CH." Eliza lifted the ring, feeling its weight, imagining the woman who had worn it through years and seasons and the hard work of frontier life. She thought about her own mother's ring, the one she wore on a chain around her neck because it had seemed too sacred to place on her hand for a marriage that wasn't built on love. But maybe love wasn't the only foundation worth building on. Maybe respect could be enough. Maybe honesty could be a start. She set the ring back in its box and finally forced herself to eat breakfast, though every bite felt like swallowing stones. The next hours passed in a blur of preparation. Ruth returned with two younger women who worked in the house, and together they helped Eliza into the cream wool dress, arranged her dark hair into something resembling elegance, and generally fussed over her until she wanted to scream. She bore it all in silence, watching her reflection transform into something bridal, something that looked almost like a real bride instead of a woman walking to her own execution. At 1:15, Ruth stepped back to survey their work. "You'll do," she said with satisfaction. "More than do, actually. You're a lovely bride, Miss Crowell." "Thank you." Eliza's voice came out steadier than she felt. She slipped her mother's ring off its chain and placed it carefully in her trunk, then picked up the wooden box containing Caleb Hawthorne's mother's ring. "I'm ready." Ruth's expression gentled. "No, you're not. But you're brave enough to do it anyway, which is better." They descended the stairs together, Ruth slightly ahead, providing a buffer between Eliza and whatever waited below. The main room had been transformed, furniture pushed back, chairs arranged in neat rows, late morning light streaming through windows that someone had obviously polished to gleaming. Perhaps 20 people stood gathered, most of them unfamiliar faces marked by the sun and wind that shaped everyone who lived in this territory. But Eliza's attention went immediately to the man standing beside the fireplace, speaking quietly with the Reverend. She'd seen Caleb Hawthorne before, of course, but always at a distance, a figure on horseback moving across the horizon, a shape glimpsed through town windows. A presence felt more than observed. Now, with nowhere to look but at him, she took in details that the stories had never mentioned. He was tall, probably 6'2", built with the lean strength of someone who'd worked physically his entire life. Dark hair, longer than fashion dictated, brushed his collar. His face was angular, hard-planed, marked by a scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, the kind of scar that came from violence, deliberate and aimed to kill. He wore a black suit that fit him well but looked uncomfortable on his frame, as if he was a wolf forced into domestic clothing. Then he turned, and Eliza saw his eyes. They were gray, the color of winter sky before snow, and they held an intensity that made her understand why people crossed streets to avoid him. But they weren't cold, she realized. They were watchful, guarded, the eyes of someone who'd learned to observe before acting, to measure before committing. Those eyes met hers across the room, and something passed between them. Acknowledgement, assessment, mutual recognition that they were both walking into unknown territory. Caleb moved toward her, his steps deliberate and measured. When he reached her, he stopped at a respectful distance, making no move to touch her. "Miss Crowell," his voice was deep, roughened by years of shouting commands across open range. "Thank you for coming." The absurdity of thanking her for attending her own wedding might have made her laugh if her throat hadn't been so tight. "Mr. Hawthorne." "Caleb," he corrected quietly. "We'll be married in a few minutes. Seems like we should use given names." Eliza, then. He nodded, then extended his hand palm up, an offer, not a demand. Shall we? She placed her hand in his, feeling calluses rough against her skin, feeling the strength in his grip tempered by obvious care not to hurt her. He led her to stand before Reverend Morrison, a portly man with kind eyes who'd baptized half the children in the territory. The ceremony was mercifully brief. The Reverend spoke about partnership and commitment, about the challenges of building a life in hard country, about the need for strength and faith in equal measure. Eliza heard it all from a distance, as if she were watching herself from outside her own body. Then came the vows. Caleb's voice was steady and clear when he spoke. I, Caleb James Hawthorne, take you, Eliza Rose Crowell, to be my wife. I promise to provide for you, to protect you, to deal with you honestly, and to honor the commitments we've made to one another. This I vow before these witnesses and on my word as a man. It wasn't the traditional ceremony, Eliza realized. He'd altered it, made it his own, stripped away the poetry, and left only concrete promises he could actually keep. Honesty, not love. Honor, not obedience. It was stark and pragmatic and somehow more real than any flowery declaration could have been. Her turn. She drew a breath and met his eyes. I, Eliza Rose Crowell, take you, Caleb James Hawthorne, to be my husband. I promise to be your partner in building this life, to bring my full strength to our shared endeavors, to speak truth even when it's difficult, and to honor the agreements we've made. This I vow before these witnesses and on my word as a woman who keeps her promises. Something flickered in those gray eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or approval. His hand tightened slightly on hers. The rings? Reverend Morrison prompted. Caleb produced his mother's ring from his pocket, and Eliza opened the wooden box she'd been clutching. He took the ring with careful fingers and slipped it onto her hand. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her all along. Then it was her turn. She'd purchased a plain gold band from her own meager savings, unwilling to let her father pay for even this small thing. She slid it onto Caleb's finger, noting the way his hand dwarfed hers, noting the scars across his knuckles, noting that he held perfectly still while she completed the gesture. By the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Reverend Morrison beamed at them both. You may kiss the bride. Caleb leaned down slowly, giving Eliza time to pull away if she chose. She didn't. His lips touched hers briefly, chastely, a seal on their bargain rather than a declaration of passion. When he pulled back, his expression remained carefully neutral, but she thought she saw a question in his eyes. She answered it with the smallest nod. I'll try. I'll actually try to make this work. Relief crossed his face so quickly she might have imagined it. The guests surged forward with congratulations that ranged from genuine to perfunctory. Eliza smiled and nodded and accepted embraces from women she didn't know, all while acutely aware of Caleb standing beside her, a solid presence that drew every eye in the room. Ruth had organized a wedding luncheon, roasted beef, fresh bread, vegetables from the ranch garden, pies and cakes contributed by neighboring women. It was spread across tables in the dining room, generous and welcoming. Caleb led Eliza to the head of the table, seating her with a courtesy that seemed ingrained rather than performed. The meal progressed with the kind of conversation that always accompanied gatherings in sparse country. Talk of weather and cattle prices, speculation about railroad expansion, news from town and distant territories. Caleb participated minimally, answering direct questions with economical responses, but Eliza noticed he listened intently to everything said, filing away information with obvious purpose. Your ranch is beautiful, Mr. Hawthorne, one of the neighbor women ventured, and now with a mistress to bring a woman's touch, it'll be a real home. Caleb's gaze shifted to Eliza. It's Eliza's home now, to manage as she sees fit. Any changes she wants to make have my full support. The declaration sent a ripple through the gathering. Eliza felt multiple pairs of eyes turn her way, reassessing, recalculating what kind of marriage this might actually be. She lifted her chin. I appreciate that, Caleb. Though I suspect I'll need time to understand how things work here before making changes. Take all the time you need. He returned his attention to his plate, apparently considering the matter settled. After the meal, guests began departing, citing afternoon chores and the long rides back to their own ranches. Reverend Morrison was the last to leave, clasping both their hands and offering blessings that Eliza appreciated more than he could know. Then they were alone in the sudden silence of the main room, husband and wife, strangers bound by law and contract and necessity. Caleb cleared his throat. I should check on the north pasture situation. The hands were having trouble with a fence section that needs replacing before we can move the herd. He paused, looking uncomfortable. Unless you need me here, I can send Samuel instead. No, go. Eliza was surprised by her own relief. I should familiarize myself with the house anyway. He nodded, already moving toward the door, then stopped. Eliza? Yes? I meant what I said, in my vows. I'll keep my word to you. He met her eyes directly, and for the first time she saw something besides careful control in his expression. A vulnerability quickly shuttered, but real nonetheless. I know this isn't what you would have chosen, but I'll do my best to make sure you don't regret it. Before she could formulate a response, he was gone, the door closing quietly behind him. Eliza stood in the empty room, turning her mother's ring in its new position on her right hand, her left hand weighted with unfamiliar gold. Through the window, she watched Caleb stride toward the barn, his movements economical and purposeful. Within minutes, he'd emerged on horseback, heading north at a controlled lope that covered ground efficiently without wasting the horse's energy. Well, she said to the empty air, now what? The answer came from Ruth, appearing with her usual impeccable timing. Now you decide what kind of mistress you'll be. Want to see the rest of the house? Eliza spent the afternoon learning the geography of her new home. The house was larger than it had seemed from outside, built in stages as the ranch prospered. The original cabin formed the core, now incorporated into the larger structure as a storage room and Ruth's domain. From there, additions sprawled, the main room where they'd been married, a formal dining room, a library that surprised her with its extensive collection, a kitchen that was Ruth's pride, and upstairs 6 bedrooms including her own, and one that had clearly been prepared for the master of the house. He'll stay in his room, Ruth said when Eliza hesitated outside the closed door. Like I mentioned, he wants you to be comfortable. When and if things change, that'll be for you both to decide. The relief Eliza felt was profound and slightly shameful. She wasn't ready for that kind of intimacy with a stranger, no matter what legal ties bound them. The tour continued. Linen closets and storage rooms, a bathing room with an actual copper tub fed by pipes connected to a cistern on the roof, a sewing room that caught the best afternoon light. Everything was clean, organized, efficiently run. You manage all this? Eliza asked. With help from 2 girls who come in daily from town, and Samuel's wife Maria handles the cooking for the hands. It's a well-oiled machine. Ruth smiled slightly. Though I'll admit it'll be nice to have another woman in the house who's not just passing through. By the time Caleb returned as the sun was setting, Eliza had changed from her wedding dress into something more practical and was in the library, examining the surprisingly eclectic book collection, agricultural manuals alongside Shakespeare, cattle breeding guides next to poetry, technical journals mixed with novels. She heard his boots in the hall, heard him pause outside the library door. Then a soft knock. Come in, she called, closing the volume of Wordsworth she'd been holding. He entered, still dusty from the ride, hat in hand. Fence is repaired. We'll move the herd tomorrow. He glanced at the book she'd set aside. You read poetry? When I have time. You collect it? Some of those were my mother's. Some I picked up over the years. He moved to the shelf, pulling down a worn copy of Walt Whitman. There's something about words that can capture what the land makes you feel, you know? The bigness of it. The loneliness. It was the most personal thing he'd said to her, and Eliza felt the first fragile thread of connection form between them. I know exactly what you mean. They stood in the fading light, the silence between them less awkward than before, until Ruth appeared to announce supper. The meal was less formal than the wedding luncheon, just Eliza, Caleb, and Ruth eating at the kitchen table because, as Ruth put it, we're family now, and family doesn't stand on ceremony. The food was excellent, and the conversation gradually found its rhythm, mainly focusing on ranch operations and the coming week's work. Caleb outlined his plans, then turned to Eliza. Your father's ranch. When do you want to ride over? I thought maybe tomorrow or the next day, so you can start assessing what needs to be done. You're putting me in charge of it? It's your inheritance. Makes sense you should manage it. He pushed food around his plate. I can provide advice, resources, manpower when you need it. But the decisions should be yours. Eliza set down her fork, studying him in the lamplight. Why did you really make this arrangement, Caleb? You could have just bought the land outright, foreclosed on the debt. He was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, I could have. Would have been simpler, probably cheaper. So why didn't you? His gray eyes met hers with that same unsettling intensity. Because your father was desperate enough to sell his daughter to save his legacy. And I figured any woman raised by a man who loved his land that much, who understood what it meant to fight for something bigger than herself, that was a woman worth knowing. He paused. Also, I was tired of eating alone. The honesty of it struck her silent. No grand declarations, no pretense at romance, just the truth, plain and unvarnished. Ruth made a small, approving sound and stood to clear plates. I'll leave you two to get acquainted. Breakfast is at 6, Eliza, but if you need to sleep later, just say so. After she left, the silence stretched between them again. Caleb stood, moving to the window that looked out over darkened pastures. I should let you rest. It's been a long day. Caleb? He turned. Thank you. For the ring, for the room, for... She gestured vaguely, encompassing the entire day. For trying to make this bearable. His expression softened almost imperceptibly. You're welcome. And Eliza? Tomorrow, if you want to ride out, see the whole operation, I can show you around. Or if you'd rather have space, I can make myself scarce. Whatever you need. I'd like to see it, she said. All of it. If I'm going to be mistress here, I should understand what that means. Something like respect flickered across his face. 6:30 then. Wear your riding clothes. He left her there, and Eliza sat listening to the sounds of the house settling into night, creaking timbers, distant voices from the bunkhouse, the wind picking up across the valley. She was married. She was Eliza Hawthorne now, mistress of this ranch, wife to a man who spoke in pragmatic truths and read poetry in secret. It wasn't the life she'd imagined. But sitting in the warm kitchen, with the taste of good food still on her tongue and the weight of honest gold on her finger, she thought maybe it didn't have to be a tragedy either. Maybe it could be something else entirely. She climbed the stairs to her room that first night as a married woman, the unfamiliar weight of the wedding ring catching lamplight as she moved. Sleep came in fragments, broken by the strangeness of new sounds and the persistent awareness that somewhere in this house her husband lay equally awake in his own bed, maintaining the careful distance he'd promised. When dawn finally broke across the mountains, Eliza rose feeling hollow and determined in equal measure. She dressed in her riding clothes, pinned her hair back severely, and descended to find Caleb already in the kitchen, drinking coffee that looked strong enough to strip paint. He glanced up at her approach, his expression unreadable in the early light. Morning, he said quietly. Coffee's fresh. Thank you. She poured herself a cup, grateful for something to do with her hands. The silence between them felt different than yesterday's awkwardness. Heavier somehow, weighted with all the questions neither of them knew how to ask. Ruth appeared with plates of eggs and bacon, hash browns, and thick slices of bread. Eat, she commanded, with the authority of someone who'd been giving orders long before either of them arrived. You'll need your strength if you're touring the whole operation today. They ate without much conversation, the scrape of forks, and the occasional request to pass salt the only sounds. But Eliza noticed the way Caleb kept his movements careful around her, how he seemed to take up less space than his frame required, as if trying to make himself less intimidating through sheer force of will. Finally, he pushed back from the table. Ready? She followed him to the barn where Samuel had already saddled 2 horses, a rangy gelding for Caleb and a smaller mare with intelligent eyes for Eliza. She ran her hand along the mare's neck, feeling the animal's warmth, her solid reality. This is Sage, Caleb said, watching her. She's got good sense and a steady temperament. She's yours now, if you like her. Eliza met the mare's liquid gaze, saw her own uncertain future reflected there. She's beautiful. She's practical, Caleb corrected, but his tone held approval. He swung onto his gelding with the ease of someone who'd spent more time in saddles than chairs. We'll start with the near pastures, work our way out to the boundaries. They rode out as the sun cleared the eastern peaks, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber. The temperature was already climbing toward what promised to be another scorching day, but the morning air still carried a hint of the night's coolness. Eliza settled into Sage's rhythm, feeling some of the tension leave her shoulders as the familiar comfort of being on horseback reasserted itself. Caleb led them first to the cattle in the near pasture, several hundred head that looked far healthier than any livestock Eliza had seen in months. They grazed on grass that was brown but still sufficient, clustered around water troughs fed by windmill pumps that turned steadily in the morning breeze. "We drill deep," Caleb explained, gesturing toward the nearest windmill. "Most folks try to rely on creeks and rivers, but when the drought hit, they learned the hard way that surface water can't be trusted. Cost me a fortune to put in the wells, but it's kept us alive when others failed." "How many wells do you have?" 12 across the property. Each one services a different pasture section." He urged his horse forward, and she followed. "The secret to surviving out here isn't hoping for rain. It's assuming it won't come and planning accordingly." They rode for hours, Caleb pointing out fence lines and boundary markers, explaining his rotation system for the cattle, showing her the line shacks where hands stayed during roundup season. He spoke more freely on horseback than he had in the house, his words coming easier when focused on concrete things, acreage and water rights, breeding stock, and winter feed calculations. Eliza absorbed it all, asking questions that seemed to surprise him with their insight. She understood ranch operations better than he'd anticipated, could read the land's capacity with an experienced eye, recognized quality stock when she saw it. Her father had taught her well, even if he'd ultimately failed to apply his own knowledge to survival. By mid-morning, they'd reached the northern boundary, where hawthorn land pressed against the foothills. Caleb dismounted near a stand of cottonwoods that marked a spring, one of the few natural water sources still flowing despite the drought. He pulled canteens from his saddlebag, offering one to Eliza as she slid from Sage's back. "This is my favorite spot on the whole ranch," he said, settling against a tree trunk. "It's where I first camped when I came to the valley, before I owned any of this. Just me and a string of horses and enough stubbornness to think I could build something from nothing." Eliza drank deeply, then sat on a nearby rock studying him in the dappled shade. "The stories about you, about where you came from before, are any of them true?" His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Which stories have you heard?" "That you killed men in Wyoming, that you were run out of Montana for violence, that you built this ranch on intimidation and fear." He was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the valley spread below them. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "I killed 2 men in Wyoming. They'd followed me from a card game in Cheyenne, figured to rob me on the trail. I gave them a chance to walk away. They didn't take it." He touched the scar on his face unconsciously. "This is from the knife one of them pulled before I shot him." Eliza felt her stomach tighten, but kept her expression neutral. "And Montana?" "I was never in Montana. That's just a story someone started, probably because it sounded dramatic." He met her eyes directly. "But I won't lie to you, Eliza. I've done things I'm not proud of. When I first came here, there were people who thought they could take what I was building. I made examples. I let rumors spread that made me sound worse than I was. I cultivated a reputation because fear is cheaper than hiring an army of gunmen. So you became the monster they expected." "I became untouchable." His voice hardened. "And it worked. Within 2 years, nobody challenged me, nobody stole from me, nobody tried to burn my buildings or poison my wells or run off my stock. I could focus on building instead of constantly defending." Eliza turned the canteen in her hands, processing this. "But that reputation, it must have cost you other things. Friends, trust, any chance at a normal life." "It did." He stood abruptly, moving to check his horse's girth, his back to her. "That's why I need you to understand something. The man people whisper about in town, the one they cross the street to avoid, that's a version of me I built deliberately. But it's not all of who I am. It's armor, Eliza, protection, and I'm asking you to see past it." She joined him by the horses, her heart beating faster. "Why me? Why now? You could have kept that armor on indefinitely." "Because I'm tired," he said simply, turning to face her. "Tired of being alone. Tired of seeing fear in every face. Tired of having no one to talk to except my foreman and my housekeeper, no matter how good they are at their jobs. He paused, something vulnerable flickering across his features. And because when your father came to me, desperate and broken, trying to save his land, I saw an opportunity. Not just to acquire property, but to maybe start over with someone who might understand what it takes to survive out here. You're asking me to trust you based on what? Honesty about being deliberately frightening? I'm asking you to judge me on my actions, not on stories. His gray eyes held her steadily. Watch how I treat the people who work for me. Watch how I handle my business. Watch how I treat you. Then decide if the legend matches the man. Eliza wanted to argue, to point out the manipulation inherent in his approach, to resist the strange pull she felt toward his brutal honesty. But standing in the shade of the cottonwoods with the valley spread before them and the truth laid bare between them, she found herself nodding slowly. "All right," she said. "I'll watch. I'll judge for myself, but Caleb, if I find out you've lied to me, if the monster turns out to be real instead of performance, there won't be enough contracts in the world to keep me here." Relief and respect warred in his expression. "That's fair. More than fair." He moved to help her mount, his hands careful as he steadied her stirrup. "Thank you for listening, for giving me a chance." They rode back in contemplative silence, the morning's revelation settling into something that felt almost like understanding. When they reached the ranch as the sun approached its zenith, Samuel met them with news that drove all other thoughts from Eliza's mind. "Your father's here, Mrs. Hawthorne," the foreman said, his expression carefully neutral. "He's waiting in the main house, says it's urgent." Eliza felt ice settle in her stomach. She dismounted quickly, barely registering Caleb's steadying hand on her elbow as she hurried toward the house. She found Thomas Crowell in the main room, pacing like a caged animal, his hat crushed in his trembling hands. "Eliza, thank heaven!" He moved toward her, then seemed to remember himself, stopping short. "I'm sorry to intrude on your first days as a married woman, but there's trouble." "What kind of trouble?" Caleb's voice came from behind her, calm but carrying an edge that made even her father flinch. "Anderson." Thomas's face twisted with anger and fear. "He's claiming the land settlement isn't valid. Says the contract specified payment within 30 days of the wedding, and since the wedding was yesterday, he's demanding immediate payment or he'll foreclose anyway." Caleb's expression went absolutely still, the kind of stillness that preceded violence. "That's not what the contract said. Payment was due within 30 days of the agreement date, which was 2 weeks ago. I've already sent the bank draft." "He's saying there was a verbal modification, that you agreed to different terms." Thomas looked near tears. "I swear to you, Hawthorne, I never agreed to any such thing. But Anderson's got the sheriff convinced, and they're talking about seizing the property tomorrow if payment isn't verified." Eliza felt rage bloom hot and bright in her chest. "He's lying. He has to be lying." "Of course he's lying." Caleb's voice was deadly quiet. "He saw an opportunity to extort more money and took it. The question is how we prove it and stop him." He moved to his desk, pulling out papers with swift efficiency. "I have the original contract here, signed and witnessed, and I have the bank receipt showing the draft was sent to Anderson's account a week ago." "He claims he never received it." Thomas sank into a chair looking older than Eliza had ever seen him. "And without proof of receipt, the sheriff says it's my word against Anderson's about the contract terms." Caleb studied the papers, his mind clearly working through possibilities. Then his expression shifted, something calculating entering his eyes. "Samuel," he called toward the door where his foreman had been waiting. "Saddle fresh horses. We're riding to town." "Caleb, what are you planning?" Eliza moved to his side, reading danger in every line of his body. "I'm planning to solve this the way I solve most problems, directly and definitively." He looked at her father. "Mr. Crowell, you'll ride with us. We're going to visit Mr. Anderson and have a conversation about honesty and consequences." "You can't just threaten him," Eliza protested, even as part of her wanted exactly that. "It'll make things worse." "I'm not going to threaten him." Caleb's smile was sharp and cold. "I'm going to give him a choice, and if he's smart, he'll take it." The ride to town was tense and swift, Caleb setting a pace that ate up miles with relentless efficiency. Eliza insisted on coming despite his attempts to dissuade her, and he'd finally relented with a look that suggested he was learning the futility of arguing with her. Her father rode in miserable silence, caught between relief at Caleb's intervention and shame at needing it. They found Garrett Anderson in his office above the general store, a prosperous man gone soft around the middle, counting money with the satisfied expression of someone who believed he'd already won. His face drained of color when Caleb filled the doorway, blocking the only exit. "Hawthorne." Anderson's voice cracked slightly. "I wasn't expecting—" "No, I imagine you weren't." Caleb moved into the room with predatory grace, and Eliza saw firsthand why people feared him. His entire bearing had changed, becoming something dangerous and barely controlled. "Let's talk about this contract dispute." "There's nothing to discuss. Crowell failed to meet the terms, and I'm within my rights to foreclose." Caleb laid the contract on Anderson's desk with exaggerated care. "This contract, signed by both parties and witnessed by your own clerk, specifies payment within 30 days of the agreement date, which was October 1st. Today is October 20th. I am well within the terms." "There was a verbal modification." "There was no verbal modification." Caleb's voice could have cut glass. "What there was, Mr. Anderson, was an attempt to extort additional money from a situation you thought you could manipulate." He pulled the bank receipt from his jacket. "This shows a draft sent to your account for the full amount owed, sent on October 8th, 12 days ago." Anderson's eyes darted between the papers and Caleb's face. "I never received—" "You received it. The bank has confirmation of deposit. What you did was sit on it, hoping to create enough confusion to demand a second payment." Caleb leaned forward, his hands flat on the desk. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to go to the sheriff right now and withdraw your complaint. You're going to acknowledge that payment was made in full and on time, and you're going to release the lien on Crowell property immediately." "And if I don't?" Anderson tried for bravado, but his voice shook. "Then I'll make a few inquiries about your business practices. Specifically, I'll look into those land deals you made last year with the railroad, the ones where properties mysteriously went into foreclosure right before the railroad needed right-of-way access." Caleb's smile was terrifying in its coldness. "I suspect the Territorial Land Office would be very interested in those coincidences, as would several families who lost their farms." Anderson's face went from pale to ashen. "You can't prove—" "I can prove enough to tie you up in investigations for years. Can you afford that kind of scrutiny, Mr. Anderson? Can your reputation survive it?" Caleb straightened. "Or you can do the right thing, admit your mistake, and walk away with your dignity and your business intact. Your choice." The silence stretched taut as wire. Eliza watched Anderson's face cycle through calculation, fear, and finally defeat. His shoulders slumped. "Fine," he muttered. "Fine, I'll withdraw the complaint. The payment was received." "And the lien?" "Released today." Caleb gathered his papers with careful precision. "Excellent choice, Mr. Anderson. I'm glad we could resolve this amicably." The word amicably dripped with irony. "Come on, Eliza. Mr. Crowell, our business here is finished." They left Anderson slumped in his chair, a man who'd gambled on intimidating the wrong people and lost badly. Outside, Thomas Crowell seemed to regain some of his color, though shame still marked his features. "Hawthorne, I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank me. Eliza is my wife now. Protecting her interests is protecting mine." Caleb's tone was matter-of-fact, but Eliza saw the way his eyes tracked her father's expression. "But you should know. This is the last time I bail you out of a mess you should have seen coming. From now on, you work with Eliza to manage the Crowell Ranch properly, or you step aside and let her do it alone." The bluntness of it made Thomas flinch, but he nodded. "You're right. You're absolutely right. Eliza, I'm sorry for all of it." "I know, Father." Eliza's voice was softer than she felt. "Go home. We'll talk tomorrow about what needs to happen next." After her father rode off, Eliza stood in the dusty street facing her husband, seeing him with new eyes. "That was necessary," he finished, "and probably exactly what you feared about marrying me, the monster coming out to solve problems through intimidation. You didn't hurt him, you just cornered him with truth." Truth delivered with enough menace to make him comply. Is there really a difference? Caleb's expression was unreadable. This is what I meant, Eliza. This is the armor, the reputation, the thing people fear. And it works every single time because men like Anderson are fundamentally cowards who prey on the desperate. Eliza moved closer, studying the face that had terrified a prosperous businessman into submission minutes ago. In the afternoon light, she could see the tiredness beneath the hard exterior, the cost of maintaining such a fearsome facade. Did you really have evidence about his railroad dealings? Some. Enough to make credible threats. He met her eyes. Would you rather I'd let him steal your father's land? No? The answer came without hesitation. No, I'm grateful you stopped him. She struggled to articulate the confusion of watching her husband transform into something frightening and then back again. I'm trying to understand who you really are beneath all the strategy and reputation. So am I, he said quietly, with such raw honesty that it stole her breath. I've been this version of myself for so long, I'm not entirely sure where the armor ends and the man begins, but I'd like to find out. With you, if you're willing. She thought about the morning ride, the vulnerable admission by the Cottonwoods, the cold efficiency with which he'd protected her family's interests. She thought about poetry collections and separate bedrooms and a wedding ring that had belonged to his mother. She thought about a man who read Whitman and drilled wells and built a ranch from nothing through sheer relentless will. I'm willing, she said finally. But Caleb, I need you to promise me something. What? That you'll always tell me the truth. Even when it's hard. Even when you think a lie would be kinder. I need to know the real man, not a version crafted for my comfort. He studied her for a long moment, then extended his hand. Deal. And you promise me the same. No polite pretense, no playing the dutiful wife when you're actually angry or hurt or disagreeing. Honesty, even when it's uncomfortable. She took his hand, feeling the calluses and strength and the slight tremor that suggested this mattered to him more than his controlled expression revealed. Deal. They rode back to the ranch in the long light of late afternoon, and something had shifted between them. Not love. That was too much to ask after barely 2 days. Not even trust, fully formed. But the beginning of something that might become partnership, built on the unlikely foundation of brutal honesty and mutual respect. That night at dinner, Ruth noticed the change immediately. You two look like you've been through a war. Just a small battle, Caleb said, reaching for the bread. Which we won. Anderson tried to cheat us, Eliza added, surprising herself with the ease of the us. Caleb persuaded him otherwise. Persuaded. Ruth's eyebrows rose. That's one word for it, I'm sure. But she looked pleased, as if some test had been passed that Eliza hadn't known she was taking. After the meal, Caleb excused himself to handle paperwork in his study, leaving Eliza to her own devices. She wandered to the library, pulling down the Whitman collection he'd mentioned that morning, finding herself drawn to Song of Myself, with its sprawling celebration of American vastness and individual strength. She was deep in the verses when she heard his footsteps pause outside the library door. She didn't look up, but she heard him enter, heard him settle into the chair across from her with a soft exhale that spoke of weariness. Read to me? He asked quietly. She glanced up, startled. What? If you're willing. It's been a long day, and there's something about hearing poetry spoken aloud that settles the mind. He looked almost embarrassed. But if you'd rather not. No, Yes. All right. Eliza found her place and began reading, her voice finding the rhythm of Whitman's long lines, the celebration of self and nation and the wild American landscape they both called home. Caleb listened with his eyes closed, his features gradually relaxing from their habitual guardedness. In the lamplight, with the pretense stripped away, he looked younger than his years, marked by hard living but not yet destroyed by it. When she finished the section she'd been reading, his eyes opened and the gratitude in them was unfeigned. Thank you, he said simply. You're welcome. Neither of them moved to leave, content to sit in comfortable silence while the evening settled around them. Outside, coyotes began their nightly chorus, wild and lonesome. Inside, two people who'd been strangers 3 days ago sat together in lamplight, learning the slow dance of coexistence that might someday become something more. The days that followed developed a rhythm that surprised Eliza with its ease. She rose early to ride out with Caleb, learning the ranch's operations with the same intensity she'd once applied to managing her father's failing property. But here, everything worked. The wells pumped reliably, the cattle thrived despite the drought. The hands respected their employer's quiet authority without the resentment that came from tyranny. She watched him carefully, holding to her promise to judge the man by his actions rather than his reputation. What she saw challenged every assumption she'd carried into their marriage. Caleb was demanding, but fair, expecting excellence while providing the resources to achieve it. When a young ranch hand made a costly mistake with a gate that let a dozen heads scatter into the foothills, Caleb didn't rage or fire him. Instead, he spent 3 hours helping retrieve the cattle, then took the time to explain proper gate protocols in a tone that was stern, but not cruel. "Mistakes happen once," he told the shamefaced boy. "What matters is whether you learn from them. I expect this particular mistake won't happen twice." "No, sir, Mr. Hawthorne, I swear it won't." "Good. Now get those cattle settled and check on the water levels in the south pasture." After the hand hurried off, Eliza rode closer to Caleb. "You were kind to him." He looked genuinely surprised. "I was practical. Good workers are hard to find. Destroying a man's confidence over an honest mistake is wasteful." He paused, reading something in her expression. "What did you expect, that I'd horsewhip him in front of the others? People say you're ruthless. I am ruthless. With people who try to cheat me, steal from me, or deliberately undermine what I'm building." His gray eyes held hers steadily. "But that boy just made an error in judgment. There's a difference between ruthless and cruel, Eliza. I've never confused the two." She was beginning to understand that distinction, to see how he'd weaponized his reputation while maintaining a core of integrity that his critics either didn't see or deliberately ignored. The monster of legend and the man she was coming to know existed simultaneously, two facets of the same complicated person. A week into their marriage, Eliza finally rode to the Crowell Ranch to assess the damage and determine what could be salvaged. Caleb accompanied her despite her assertion that she could handle it alone, saying nothing but making his presence a quiet support she found herself grateful for. The ranch looked worse than she'd remembered. The main house sagged with deferred maintenance, fences hung loose on rotting posts, and the few remaining cattle were pitiful shadows of healthy stock. Her father met them in the yard, his shame evident in every defeated line of his body. "It's bad," he said unnecessarily. "Worse than I wanted you to see." Eliza dismounted, walking slowly through the property that held every memory of her childhood. The barn where her mother had taught her to gather eggs. The paddock where she'd learned to ride. The porch where she'd sat on summer evenings watching storms roll across the mountains. All of it decaying, neglected, dying by inches. "We can fix this," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "It'll take work and money and time, but we can bring it back." Caleb had been walking the fence line, examining posts with a critical eye. Now he returned, his expression thoughtful. "You'll need to replace most of the fencing. The well needs deepening, or you need to drill a new one. The cattle you have should be sold off. They're too far gone to recover properly. Better to start fresh with healthy stock once the infrastructure is sound." Thomas flinched at each assessment, but he didn't argue. "I don't have the money for any of that." "No, but I do." Caleb's tone was matter-of-fact. "And Eliza has access to it through our marriage contract. The question is whether you're willing to do the work required to make the investment worthwhile." "I'll do whatever it takes." "Words are easy, Mr. Crowell." Caleb's voice hardened slightly. "I need to know you're committed to this, that you won't slide back into old patterns, hoping someone else will bail you out when things get difficult." Eliza expected her father to bristle at the bluntness, but instead Thomas met Caleb's gaze directly. "You're right to question my commitment. I've failed this land and my daughter through weakness and poor decisions, but I'm asking for one more chance to prove I can do better." Something in his tone must have satisfied Caleb because he nodded slowly. "All right, here's what we'll do. I'll provide the capital and the manpower to get the ranch operational again. In exchange, you work alongside my hands, take direction from my foreman,
and learn to manage this property the way it should be managed. Once it's profitable again, you'll repay the investment from the proceeds. Agreed? Agreed. Thomas extended his hand and Caleb shook it firmly. Eliza felt tears prick her eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. This ranch represented her mother's memory, her grandfather's legacy, her own childhood. Watching it come back to life felt like resurrection, like hope made tangible. She turned away quickly, not wanting either man to see her emotion, but Caleb's hand settled gently on her shoulder. "It's all right," he said quietly, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "It's worth crying over, worth fighting for." She nodded, not trusting her voice, and his hand squeezed once before releasing her. They spent the rest of the day making plans, Caleb sketching improvements in the dirt with a stick, while Thomas listened with the desperate attention of a man being thrown a lifeline. By the time they rode back to Hawthorne Ranch in the fading light, Eliza felt exhausted but cautiously hopeful. "Thank you," she said as they approached the barn, "for helping him, for not just writing the property off as hopeless. It's not hopeless. Neglected, yes. Mismanaged, absolutely. But the land is good, and the location is solid." Caleb dismounted, then moved to help her down, his hand steady at her waist. "Besides, it matters to you. That makes it worth saving." The simple statement shouldn't have affected her as strongly as it did, but Eliza felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the defensive walls she'd built around her heart. She looked up at him in the twilight, seeing the man who'd defended her family's interests, who'd offered her father dignity along with discipline, who read poetry and drilled wells and somehow managed to be both feared and fundamentally decent. "Caleb, she started, then hesitated, unsure how to articulate what she was feeling. "What is it?" "I'm glad I married you, Shai." The words came out in a rush. "I know that sounds strange given how we started, but I'm grateful it was you and not someone else." His expression transformed, vulnerability breaking through his usual careful control. "That means more than you know, Eliza." He seemed to struggle with his next words. "I've been trying to give you space, trying not to push for more than you're willing to give. But I want you to know, this marriage, this partnership we're building, it's becoming the most important thing in my life." She reached up, touching the scar on his face with tentative fingers. He went absolutely still, barely breathing, as she traced the line from temple to jaw. "Tell me how you really got this," she said softly. "Not the sanitized version. The truth." He caught her hand gently, holding it against his face. "The man who did it was trying to kill me for a horse I'd won fairly in a card game. He came at me with a knife while I was sleeping, got in one good cut before I could defend myself. I shot him because he left me no choice. And I've carried this scar ever since as a reminder that trust is dangerous and mercy can be fatal." "Is that why you keep people at a distance? Why you built that reputation?" "Partly. Also because being alone is simpler than being disappointed by people." His thumb stroked across her knuckles. "But it's also lonely. And lately, I've been wondering if simple is worth the cost." Eliza felt her pulse quicken, aware of how close they were standing, how his hand engulfed hers with warmth and strength, how his eyes held something that looked dangerously like tenderness. "What changed?" "You did." He released her hand slowly, as if reluctant to break contact. "Having you here, talking with you, watching you navigate this new life with courage and honesty. It's made me remember what I've been missing, what I gave up when I decided being feared was safer than being known." They stood in the gathering darkness, the space between them charged with possibility. Eliza knew she could step back, retreat to the safety of their carefully maintained distance. Or she could step forward into something uncertain and potentially transformative. Before she could decide, Samuel's voice called from the barn. "Mr. Hawthorne, sorry to interrupt, but there's a situation with the fence crew at the north boundary. They need your input before they can proceed." The moment fractured. Caleb stepped back, his expression shifting back to business mode with visible effort. "I'll be right there." He looked at Eliza, regret clear in his eyes. "We should talk more. Later, when there's time." "Yes," she agreed, her voice slightly unsteady. "Later." She watched him stride toward the barn, his movements purposeful and controlled, then turned toward the house where lamplight already glowed in the windows.
Ruth met her at the door with a knowing look that suggested she'd witnessed at least part of the exchange. "Supper will be ready in 20 minutes, the housekeeper said. "You've got time to wash up and change if you like." "Thank you, Ruth." Eliza headed for the stairs, then paused. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." Has Caleb ever courted anyone before? Before me?" Ruth's expression softened. "Not that I've seen. There were women who tried to catch his eye, especially early on when it became clear he was going to be successful. But he never showed interest. I think he'd convinced himself he was better off alone." She smiled slightly. "You've unsettled him in ways he didn't expect. It's good for him, even if it's uncomfortable." Eliza climbed to her room, Ruth's words echoing in her mind. She changed into a simple dress for dinner, pinning her hair back with less severity than usual, and found herself checking her reflection with an attention she hadn't paid since arriving. The woman looking back at her seemed different somehow. Less resigned, more alive, cautiously hopeful in a way that felt both dangerous and exhilarating. Caleb returned just as Ruth was setting food on the table, dust-covered and apologetic. "Sorry, that took longer than expected. Give me 5 minutes to wash up." He returned quickly, his hair damp from washing, wearing a clean shirt that made his eyes look more blue than gray in the lamplight. They ate together as had become their custom, the conversation flowing easily through ranch matters and small observations about the day. But underneath ran a current of awareness, the unfinished conversation hovering between them like a promise. After the meal, they gravitated to the library as they'd been doing each evening. But tonight, instead of settling into separate chairs, Caleb sat on the small sofa and Eliza found herself choosing the space beside him. Not touching, but close enough that she could feel his warmth, close enough that the air seemed to hum with possibility. "What should I read tonight?" she asked, surveying the shelves. "Something hopeful," he said. "Something that believes in second chances." She selected a collection of Emerson's essays, finding the one titled Self-Reliance, that seemed appropriate for two people trying to forge something new from unpromising circumstances. She began reading, her voice finding the rhythm of the philosopher's optimistic prose, his conviction that individuals could transcend their circumstances through will and authenticity. Caleb listened with the same focused attention he gave everything, but she felt his gaze on her as much as he heard her words. When she glanced over, their eyes met and held, and she saw in his expression everything he wasn't saying, desire tempered by patience, hope struggling against the habit of expecting disappointment, want held carefully in check by respect for her boundaries. She set the book aside. "Caleb." "Yes?" "I don't want separate rooms anymore." The words hung in the air between them, bold and terrifying and honest. His expression went through several rapid transformations: surprise, hope, caution, and finally something that looked like reverence. "Are you sure?" His voice was rough with restraint. "I don't want you to feel pressured. We can continue as we have been for as long as you need." "I'm sure." She turned to face him fully. "This marriage started as a bargain, a transaction to save my family's land. But it's becoming something else, something real. And I don't want to hide behind propriety and fear when there's a chance for it to become something even more." He reached for her hand slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. When she didn't, his fingers laced through hers with a gentleness that belied his size and strength. "Eliza, I need you to understand something. I'm not good at this. At intimacy, at emotional vulnerability, I've spent years building walls, and I don't know if I can tear them all down overnight." "I don't need them all down overnight." She squeezed his hand. "I just need you to keep trying, to keep being honest with me, to let me see the real man, not just the armor." "I can do that." He brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that sent warmth cascading through her. "I want to do that." She leaned toward him, and he met her halfway, his kiss gentle and questioning, asking permission with every careful touch. She answered by deepening the kiss, by bringing her free hand up to his face, by letting him know through action what words couldn't quite convey. When they finally pulled apart, both slightly breathless, his eyes held wonder. "I don't deserve you," he said quietly. "That's not for you to decide." She smiled, feeling brave and terrified and exhilarated all at once. "I'm choosing this, choosing you. Maybe it's foolish, maybe it's too soon, but it feels right." Does it feel right to you? More right than anything in my life. He stood, drawing her up with him, his hands steady at her waist. But we should do this properly. Let me court you the way I should have from the beginning.
Let me show you that I'm capable of being more than a hard man with a fearsome reputation. You already have shown me that, Eliza protested, but he shook his head. Letting you see glimpses isn't the same as deliberately building something together. Give me time to do this right, to earn what you're offering instead of just accepting it because we're already bound by law. The request surprised her, but as she studied his earnest expression, she understood. He was asking for the chance to prove himself, to transform their marriage of convenience into something chosen and cherished. And who was she to deny him that opportunity when it clearly mattered so much? All right, she agreed. Court me then. Show me who Caleb Hawthorne is when he's trying to win a woman's heart instead of intimidate his enemies. Relief and determination crossed his face. Thank you. He kissed her once more, lingering this time, letting her feel the depth of what he was holding in check. When he pulled back, his breathing was unsteady. I should go, before I forget all my good intentions. She watched him leave, his steps reluctant but resolute, and found herself smiling in the empty library. The marriage she'd entered with fear and resentment was transforming into something she was beginning to want, with an intensity that should probably frighten her, but instead felt like coming home. The next morning, Eliza woke to find a single wildflower on her breakfast tray, a mountain aster, purple and delicate, with a note in Caleb's angular handwriting. Found this on my ride this morning. It reminded me of you, resilient enough to thrive in hard country, beautiful despite harsh conditions. She pressed the flower between the pages of her Whitman collection and went downstairs with a lightness in her step that Ruth noticed immediately. You're smiling, the housekeeper observed. Must have been a good evening. It was. Eliza couldn't stop the grin from spreading. It really was. Caleb appeared from his study, and the look that passed between them was warm enough to make Ruth discreetly find business elsewhere. He crossed to Eliza, taking her hand and bringing it to his lips, as he had the night before. Good morning, wife. Good morning, husband. The words felt different now, weighted with affection rather than obligation. I need to ride to town for supplies, and I thought perhaps you'd like to come. We could have lunch at the hotel, walk through the shops, let people see us together. He looked almost nervous. If you'd like. I'd like that very much. They rode to town side by side, Caleb pointing out landmarks and telling her stories about the valley's history, his voice more animated than she'd heard it before. In town, she noticed the way people reacted to them, the surprised glances, the whispered conversations, the reassessment happening in real time as they saw Caleb Hawthorne transformed from solitary intimidator to attentive husband. At the general store, he stood patiently while she examined fabric and kitchen goods, offering opinions when asked and carrying her selections without complaint. At the hotel restaurant, he seated her with careful courtesy and ordered the best items on the menu, his attention focused entirely on her despite the curious stares from other diners. You're causing quite a stir, she murmured over coffee. People can't seem to reconcile this version of you with the legend. Good. Let them be confused. Maybe it'll make them think twice about believing every story they hear. He reached across the table, covering her hand with his. Besides, I don't care what they think. I care what you think. I think you're trying very hard to be charming. Is it working? He laughed, the sound surprising her with its genuine delight. Yes, actually, it is. They lingered over the meal, talking about everything and nothing, learning each other's preferences and histories, filling in the gaps that their rushed marriage had created. Eliza told him about her mother, about the ranch before the drought, about dreams she'd had as a girl that seemed foolish now, but had once felt possible. Caleb shared stories about his childhood in Texas, about learning to ranch from his father, about the restlessness that had driven him north to Colorado in search of something he couldn't quite name. I think I was looking for this, he said, gesturing between them. For someone who could understand what it takes to survive out here. For a partner instead of a liability. For someone who wouldn't need me to be gentle because she was strong enough to stand on her own. And now that you've found it? His expression turned serious, his eyes holding hers with absolute honesty. Now I'm terrified I'll do something to destroy it, that the hard edges people fear will cut you eventually, that you'll wake up one day and realize you've tied yourself to a man who's better at building fences than building relationships. Eliza set down her coffee cup, reaching across to take both his hands in hers. Caleb, listen to me. I'm not fragile. I'm not going to shatter because you're not perfect. We're both learning how to do this, and we're going to make mistakes. But as long as we're honest with each other, as long as we keep trying, I think we have a chance at something real. The relief in his eyes was profound. When did you get so wise? Probably around the time I had to choose between losing everything or marrying a stranger. Adversity tends to clarify things. They rode home at the golden light of late afternoon, the horses moving at an easy walk, neither of them in a hurry to end the day. When they reached the ranch, Caleb helped her dismount, his hands lingering at her waist, his expression holding a question. Tonight, he said softly, after dinner, will you walk with me? There's something I want to show you. Of course. Dinner passed in pleasant conversation, Ruth clearly pleased by the easy warmth between them. When the meal ended, Caleb offered Eliza his arm and led her outside into the cool evening air. He guided her past the barn and corrals, up a gentle slope that overlooked the ranch buildings and the valley beyond. At the top, he stopped and turned to face her. When I first came to this valley, I stood on this exact spot and imagined what I wanted to build. A ranch that would last. Buildings that would stand against weather and time. A legacy that would outlive me. He paused, his voice roughening with emotion. But I never imagined having someone to share it with, someone who would make it all mean something beyond just surviving. Eliza felt tears prick her eyes. Caleb, let me finish. He took her hands, his thumb stroking gently across her knuckles. Eliza Rose Hawthorne, I know our marriage started as a business arrangement, but I'm asking you now, as a man asking the woman he's falling in love with, will you choose me again? Not because of contracts or land or obligations, but because you want this. Want us? The tears spilled over, but she was smiling through them. Yes. 1,000 times yes. I choose you, Caleb. I choose this life we're building together. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in impossible shades of crimson and gold. And for the first time since her father had presented her with that terrible bargain, Eliza felt truly free, free to choose her own future, free to love this complicated man, free to build something that was wholly theirs. That night marked the true beginning of their marriage. Not the ceremony performed by Reverend Morrison, but the choice they made together on that hillside overlooking the valley. When Caleb led Eliza back to the house, his hand steady in hers, they moved past her room and continued to his. The space that had been his solitary domain became theirs, transformed by intention and the quiet intimacy of shared vulnerability. He was careful with her, patient in ways that spoke to a tenderness he'd kept hidden beneath years of necessary hardness. And she met him with equal courage, offering herself not from obligation, but from genuine desire to know this man completely, to bridge the final distance between them. Later, lying in the darkness with her head on his chest and his arm wrapped securely around her, Eliza felt the last of her resistance dissolve into something that felt dangerously close to peace. I was so afraid of you, she whispered into the quiet. When my father first said your name, all I could think about were the stories, the violence, the cold ruthlessness. His chest rumbled with a soft laugh. I cultivated those stories deliberately, seemed smarter than actually having to be violent all the time. His hand traced lazy patterns on her shoulder. But I won't pretend I'm not capable of it. When something threatens what's mine, I can be exactly as ruthless as the reputation suggests. What's yours? She tilted her head to look up at him. This ranch. The people who work for me. He paused, his expression tender in the moonlight filtering through the window. You. Especially you now. I'm not property to be defended, Caleb. No, you're infinitely more valuable than property. You're my partner, my wife, the person I wake up thinking about and fall asleep grateful for. His voice roughened with emotion. And if anyone ever tried to hurt you or take you from me, they'd discover that every terrible story they've heard about Caleb Hawthorne
was actually an understatement. She should have been frightened by the barely leashed violence in his tone, but instead she felt cherished, protected in a way that had nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with being valued. "I love you," she said, the words slipping out before she'd consciously decided to speak them. He went absolutely still beneath her. "Say that again." "I love you, Caleb Hawthorne. Somewhere between fear and partnership and learning who you really are, I fell completely in love with you." He shifted, rolling so he could see her face clearly, his expression a mixture of wonder and something that looked almost like fear. "I don't deserve that. Don't deserve you. Stop telling me what you deserve and just accept what I'm giving you." She cupped his scarred face in her hands. "I love you. What are you going to do about it?" His answer came in kisses and whispered declarations and a tenderness that left them both breathless and transformed. And when they finally slept, wrapped around each other as if afraid to let go, Eliza knew with absolute certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The weeks that followed brought a rhythm to their lives that felt both natural and miraculous. Eliza divided her time between learning the intricacies of Hawthorne Ranch and overseeing the restoration of her family's property. Under Caleb's direction and Samuel's supervision, the Crowell Ranch began its slow resurrection. New fences went up straight and strong. A deeper well was drilled, striking water that flowed clear and cold. The dilapidated buildings received repairs that would see them through another generation. Her father worked alongside Caleb's men with a humility that spoke to genuine transformation. Thomas Crowell had been broken by his failures, and Eliza watched him slowly rebuild not just his ranch, but his sense of purpose. He deferred to Samuel's expertise, took direction without complaint, and gradually earned back a measure of self-respect through honest labor. One afternoon, Eliza rode over to find her father mending fence with two of Caleb's hands. He looked up at her approach, his face weathered and tired, but holding none of the defeated shame that had marked it weeks before. "Eliza." He set down his tools, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Come to check on the old man's progress?" "Come to see how the ranch is coming along," she corrected, dismounting. "And it looks good, Father. Really good." He surveyed the neat fence line, the repaired barn visible in the distance, the few head of new cattle Caleb had provided grazing on recovering pasture. "Your husband knows what he's doing, and he's been more than fair with me, more than I deserve after how I handled things. He respects people who work hard and own their mistakes. You're doing both." Thomas moved closer, his expression serious. "I owe you an apology, Eliza. A real one, not the ashamed mumbling I gave you before. I sold you to save my pride, and I dressed it up as saving the ranch, but really I was just too weak to face losing everything I'd failed to protect. Father, let me finish." He held up a hand. "You deserve better than being traded like livestock. You deserved a choice, a courtship, a marriage built on something besides desperation and debt. And instead I gave you to a man I barely knew because I was too afraid to lose the only thing I had left." His voice cracked. "Your mother would have been ashamed of me." Eliza felt tears burn behind her eyes. "Mama would have understood that you were drowning and grabbed the only lifeline available. She would have been disappointed in your choices, but she would have forgiven you." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "And I forgive you too, Father, because despite the terrible circumstances, you gave me something precious. You gave me Caleb." Thomas's eyes widened. "You're happy then? Truly?" "Truly. He's a good man underneath all the intimidating exterior. He's kind and thoughtful and working so hard to be vulnerable with me despite years of training himself not to be." She smiled. "I love him, Father, and he loves me. So while I'll never be grateful for the way we started, I'm grateful for where we've ended up." Her father pulled her into a fierce hug, his shoulders shaking slightly. "Then I'll spend the rest of my life earning that forgiveness and trying to be worthy of having a daughter like you." They stood together in the afternoon sun, healing wounds that had festered for weeks, building something new on the foundation of honesty and hard work. When Eliza rode back to Hawthorne Ranch as the sun dipped toward the mountains, she felt lighter than she had in months, as if releasing the weight of anger had freed space for joy to flourish.
Caleb met her in the yard, his expression transforming from concern to relief when he saw her face. How did it go? Better than expected. We talked, really talked, and I think we're going to be all right. He pulled her into his arms right there in front of anyone who might be watching, kissing her with a tenderness that still surprised her every time. I'm glad. Family's important, even when they disappoint us. Speaking of family, Eliza pulled back slightly, her heart racing with nervous excitement. I have something to tell you. I've been waiting to be sure, and Ruth helped me confirm it this morning. His expression shifted through confusion to dawning hope. Eliza? I'm pregnant, Caleb. We're going to have a baby. The careful control he maintained so religiously shattered completely. His face cycled through shock, joy, fear, and wonder in rapid succession before settling on something that looked like reverence. A baby. We're having a baby? In about 6 months, if Ruth's calculations are right. She watched emotions play across his features, saw the vulnerability he usually guarded so carefully laid completely bare. Are you happy? Happy doesn't begin to cover it. His voice was rough with unshed tears. Terrified. Overwhelmed. Grateful beyond words. He placed his hand gently on her still flat stomach. A child. Our child. Eliza, I don't know how to be a father. What if I'm too hard, too damaged, too... She covered his hand with hers. You'll learn. We'll learn together, and our child will know they're loved, wanted, and valued. That's what matters most. He kissed her again, deeper this time, pouring everything he couldn't articulate into the gesture. When they finally broke apart, he was smiling with an openness she'd never seen before, all his carefully constructed walls completely demolished by joy. The news spread through the ranch like wildfire. Ruth beamed with proprietary satisfaction as if she'd personally arranged the pregnancy. Samuel offered gruff congratulations and immediately began planning modifications to the house to make it safer for a child. Even the ranch hands seemed genuinely pleased, their respect for Caleb extending to happiness at his good fortune. That evening, Caleb insisted on writing to inform Thomas personally. They found him finishing repairs on the barn roof, and the joy that transformed his weathered face when Eliza shared the news was almost painful to witness. A grandchild, he breathed. I'm going to be a grandfather. He climbed down from the roof with more energy than Eliza had seen from him in years. This child will inherit both ranches, both legacies. Everything your grandfather built, everything your mother loved, everything I almost destroyed, it'll live on through them. The child will inherit more than land, Caleb said quietly. They'll inherit the knowledge that family stands together, that mistakes can be forgiven, that hard work and honesty build foundations that last. Thomas extended his hand and Caleb shook it firmly, the gesture sealing something beyond mere civility. Two men who'd started as near adversaries, bound by a desperate bargain, acknowledging their transformation into family. The pregnancy progressed with surprising ease despite Eliza's initial fears. She continued riding and working around the ranch into her 4th month before Caleb's worry finally convinced her to limit her activities to lighter tasks. She chafed at the restriction but understood it came from love rather than a desire to control, so she channeled her energy into preparing the nursery and managing household operations with Ruth. The transformation in Caleb was remarkable to witness. The hard edges that had defined him for years softened incrementally, worn down by happiness and hope. He became more open with his affection, more willing to smile in public, more connected to the community that had feared him for so long. People in town began to see him differently, not as the intimidating cattle baron who ruled through reputation, but as a man building a family and a legacy worth protecting. One evening in her 6th month, Eliza stood at the nursery window watching Caleb work with his men in the paddock below. He'd removed his shirt in the heat, and she could see the play of muscle across his back as he demonstrated proper technique for breaking a young horse to saddle. His patience with the animal mirrored his patience with her, with the ranch hands, with the slow process of becoming someone capable of tenderness. Ruth appeared beside her, following her gaze. He's a different man than the one I started working for 5 years ago. How so? Back then, he was all sharp edges and cold efficiency. Got the job done, treated people fairly, but there was no warmth in it, no joy. Ruth smiled.
You've gentled him without weakening him, given him something to protect beyond just property and reputation. He's done the same for me, Eliza admitted. Shown me that strength doesn't require hardness, that vulnerability can coexist with courage. That's what good marriages do. They make both people better than they'd be alone. As Eliza's time drew near, preparations intensified. Caleb rode to town and returned with the doctor, insisting he stay at the ranch for the final 2 weeks to ensure immediate care when labor began. He hovered anxiously, driving Eliza to distraction with his worry until she finally ordered him to go work off his nervous energy by helping Samuel with the spring cattle drive. Labor began on a warm May morning when wildflowers painted the valley in impossible colors. The pains started gently, easy enough to ignore while Eliza finished breakfast and tidied the kitchen. But by mid-morning, they'd intensified to the point where Ruth took one look at her face and sent for the doctor and Caleb simultaneously. Caleb arrived at a dead run, his horse lathered and blowing, his face pale beneath his tan. He took the stairs 3 at a time and burst into their bedroom where Eliza labored under Ruth's patient guidance and the doctor's professional supervision. "I'm here," he gasped, moving to her side and taking her hand. "I'm right here, Eliza." She gripped his hand through the next contraction, her nails digging into his palm hard enough to leave marks. "Took you long enough," she managed when it passed. "What were you doing, stopping to admire the scenery?" His laugh was shaky with relief at her humor despite the pain. "Probably broke 3 speed records getting back here. Samuel's going to have words about how I treated that horse." The labor progressed slowly through the afternoon and into evening. Caleb never left her side, murmuring encouragement, offering water and cool cloths, bearing the crushing grip of her hands through each contraction without complaint. His fear was palpable, his control fraying with each sound of pain she couldn't suppress, but he held steady because she needed him to. As twilight painted the room in shades of amber and rose, the doctor announced it was time to push. Caleb supported Eliza's shoulders, his strength a bulwark she could lean against, his voice in her ear anchoring her through the hardest work of her life. And then, a thin, outraged wail that silenced every other sound. "It's a boy," the doctor announced, holding up a red-faced, squalling infant. "Strong lungs on this one." Caleb's face transformed with wonder as Ruth cleaned the baby and wrapped him in soft blankets before placing him in Eliza's arms. The infant quieted immediately at his mother's touch, his tiny face scrunching as he tried to focus on her features. "Hello, little one," Eliza whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Welcome to the world." Caleb reached out with a trembling hand to touch his son's downy head, his expression holding more emotion than Eliza had thought one face could contain. "He's perfect," he breathed. "Absolutely perfect." "What will you name him?" Ruth asked softly. Eliza looked up at her husband, seeing her own joy reflected and magnified in his eyes. "Thomas James Hawthorne," she said, watching Caleb's face carefully. "If that's acceptable to you. For my father and for you." His throat worked visibly. "More than acceptable. It's perfect." He bent to kiss her forehead gently. "Thank you. For him. For choosing me. For making my life mean something beyond just survival." The baby, Thomas, their son, made a small sound, and both parents immediately focused all attention on him, marveling at the tiny perfection of fingers and toes, the shock of dark hair, the way his hand wrapped instinctively around Caleb's offered finger. "He's so small," Caleb marveled. "How is something this small even real?" "He'll grow fast enough," the doctor assured him, packing his instruments with satisfaction. "Both mother and baby are healthy and strong. Keep her rested for the next few weeks, and they'll both be fine." After the doctor left and Ruth had fussed over them both to her satisfaction before retreating to give them privacy, Caleb settled carefully beside Eliza on the bed, both of them unable to look away from their son. "I never imagined this," he said quietly. "Never let myself hope for it. A wife who loved me, a child, a family." His voice cracked. "I thought I'd spend my life alone, feared and respected but never truly known." "Well, you're thoroughly known now," Eliza said, exhaustion making her words slightly slurred. "For better or worse, I've seen every part of you. The ruthless cattle baron and the man who reads poetry. The intimidating presence and the gentle husband, the legend and the reality. And you still love me? Even knowing all of it? Especially knowing all of it. She leaned her head against his shoulder. You're a complicated man, Caleb Hawthorne. Hard when you need to be, tender when it matters, fiercely protective of what's yours. And somehow, against all odds and terrible first impressions, you're exactly who I needed. They sat together as darkness fell completely, their son sleeping peacefully between them, and Eliza thought about the journey that had brought them here. The forced choice that had seemed like the end of her freedom. The fear and resentment she'd carried into marriage. The slow revelation of who Caleb truly was beneath the reputation. The choice to love him, not despite who he was, but because of it. The next morning brought visitors. Thomas Crowell arrived at dawn, his face wet with tears when Eliza placed his grandson in his arms. He's beautiful, he whispered. Perfect. And you named him after me? You're his grandfather, Eliza said simply. And you've worked hard to become someone worthy of that honor. We wanted to acknowledge it. Her father held the baby with the careful reverence of someone being given a second chance at something precious. I'll be better for him than I was for you, he promised. This child will know his grandfather as a man who made mistakes but learned from them, who failed but found the courage to try again. Samuel and Maria came, bringing food and congratulations. The ranch hands filed through in respectful groups, offering awkward well wishes to the tiny heir of Hawthorne Ranch. Even some of the neighboring families who'd whispered fearfully about Caleb for years came to pay their respects, their expressions shifting as they witnessed the intimidating cattle baron transformed into a gentle father. The weeks that followed established new rhythms. Eliza recovered her strength while learning the consuming demands of motherhood. Caleb proved surprisingly adept with the baby, his large hands gentle as he changed diapers and walked the floor during night feedings, singing soft songs in a rumbling voice that never failed to soothe their son. The ranches prospered under their combined management. The Crowell property, now fully restored, produced modest but respectable returns under Thomas's careful stewardship. Hawthorne Ranch expanded its operations, Caleb's reputation shifting from feared intimidator to respected leader, whose word was absolute but whose fairness was equally legendary. One evening, when Thomas was nearly a year old, Eliza stood on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of fire and gold. Caleb joined her, their son balanced easily on his hip, and together they surveyed the valley that had become their kingdom. "Do you ever regret it?" Caleb asked quietly. "The choice you made? The life you could have had if circumstances had been different?" Eliza took her son from his arms, settling the sleepy boy against her shoulder while taking Caleb's hand with her free one. "Not for a single moment. This life, this family, this love, it's worth every moment of fear and uncertainty it took to get here. Even being forced to marry the most intimidating man in the territory? Especially that." She squeezed his hand. "Because that intimidating man turned out to be the best partner I could have asked for. Strong enough to build an empire, gentle enough to change diapers at 2 a.m, brave enough to let someone see past his armor to the good man underneath." He pulled her close, careful of the baby between them, and kissed her with a tenderness that still made her heart race after more than a year of marriage. "I love you, Eliza Hawthorne. You and this boy, and the life we're building together. It's more than I ever dreamed possible. I love you too, monster and man, legend and reality, all of it." Young Thomas chose that moment to let out a mighty yawn, reminding them that bedtime approached. They moved inside together, a family bound not by the desperate contract that had brought them together, but by the choices they'd made since. Choices to be honest, to be vulnerable, to build trust one day at a time. Choices to see past fear to possibility, past reputation to truth, past obligation to love. Years later, when Thomas was old enough to understand, Eliza would tell him the story of how his parents met. Not a fairy tale of love at first sight, but the truth about desperate circumstances and forced choices. About a rancher's daughter who married a stranger to save her family's land. About a cattle baron whose fearsome reputation hid a lonely man yearning for connection. About two people who started as adversaries bound by contract and became partners bound by something far stronger. She would tell him that real love wasn't about perfect circumstances or grand gestures. It was about showing up every day with honesty and effort,
about choosing each other again and again despite fear and doubt, about having the courage to be vulnerable and the strength to be gentle. And she would tell him that sometimes the worst moments of our lives, the forced choices, the impossible situations, the times when we have no good options, sometimes those moments lead us exactly where we need to be. Not despite the hardship, but because of it. Because if Thomas Crowell hadn't been desperate enough to make a devil's bargain, if Caleb Hawthorne hadn't been lonely enough to accept it, if Eliza hadn't been brave enough to see past her fear to the man beneath the legend, none of this would exist. Not the thriving ranches, not the restored family legacy, not the love that had transformed two solitary people into an unbreakable partnership. The valley stretched out beneath the stars, peaceful and prosperous, marked by the labor of generations. The Crowell-Hawthorne legacy, built on hard ground, watered by tears and sweat and honest effort, grown strong through adversity and choice. A testament to the truth that sometimes the best things in life come from the worst circumstances, if we're brave enough to see the possibilities hidden in the pain. And in the main house of Hawthorne Ranch, a family settled into evening routines with the easy comfort of people who knew they were exactly where they belonged. A child sleeping peacefully. A grandfather finding redemption through honest work. A woman who'd been forced into marriage discovering that she'd found her home. A man who'd built walls of fear learning that love required their destruction. The monster of legend had become a husband, a father, a man whose greatest strength was no longer his capacity for intimidation, but his willingness to be vulnerable with the people he loved. And the woman who'd married him out of obligation had chosen him out of love, proving that the heart knows its own path even when circumstances try to dictate a different direction. Their story wasn't a fairy tale. It was something better, a testament to resilience, choice, and the transformative power of honesty. A reminder that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. That love doesn't require perfect circumstances, just people willing to show up authentically and do the work. And as the stars wheeled overhead and the valley slept in peaceful darkness, the legacy they were building together stood as proof that even the hardest hearts can soften when given reason enough to